Welcome to the Tamarind Learning Podcast, where host Dr. Kirby Ross-Plock speaks with experts on many topics relevant in the ultra-high net worth family wealth management space. Kirby is author of several books, including The Complete Family Office Handbook, and shares her expertise consulting with families and family offices. Kirby is also the founder of Tamarind Learning, an online wealth education platform that develops practical, foundational learning programs for beneficiaries to help them prepare for responsible stewardship of wealth.
Welcome to the Tamarind Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirby Ross-Plock, and today I am so pleased to have with me Amy Hart Clyne and Dennis Jaffe, both who have just released a new book called Finding Her Voice and Creating a Legacy. It's really awesome. So if you haven't heard about this, that's really what we're talking about today. And Amy is a veteran in the family office and family wealth space. She's Chief Knowledge and Learning Officer at Pitcairn, which is a multifamily office and has wonderful services and offerings, full service. And Dennis is a voluminous author and researcher and advisor and has recently just joined Banyan Global, a consulting firm for families of wealth, business families, and ultra high net worth individuals. So I'm so thankful for you both being on the podcast today.
Great.
Thanks for having us. It's great to
Thank
see
you.
with you.
So I'm so excited to learn more about your book. I've read it. It's illuminating and fascinating. Tell us a little bit more about this study, Amy. How did this all come into being?
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, it was, a great privilege to not only work with my friend and colleague and mentor, Dennis Jaffe, but to really engage with women of wealth, women that I have spent my career working to support as matriarchs in multi-generational families. And Dennis and I got together on a really an element of curiosity around who these women are, what role they play in wealthy families, and what that means to our work as advisors to families of wealth, and certainly what it means to the community and the world at large. And so I'd love to sort of describe a little bit more about who they are and our methodology in the study. So Dennis and I spoke to women leaders in significant families of wealth. We conducted about 40 interviews. These women were very wealthy, in excess of net worth of about a $500 million. They were women who were both active in the creation of their wealth, as well as inheritors of wealth. And so our conversations with them really focused on how they came to the wealth, what their role was in the family, how they tackled obstacles and what lessons they learned, and really the implications of the study were really quite profound.
Well, one of the things I loved about your book is it helped me kind of clarify and sort of parse, right, the differences. I mean, you mentioned about these sort of two groups. Maybe you and Dennis can unpack a little bit more about how the inheritors sort of profile was similar or different than, say, the newer wealth creators or copreneurs or whatever, however they created it more recent.
Mm-hmm.
So what was really interesting was that there were differences between the two cohorts, new to wealth and those who were inheritors, but there were some common themes that I'll touch on really to kind of kick this off. And one of the themes was that whether they were new to wealth or inheritors, was that we knew what they didn't like. And what they didn't like was being called a matriarch. They viewed it as a dated concept. They viewed it as, for those who were younger, matriarchs in their 40s or 50s, they felt that it was a term that you earned over time. They didn't yet earn that role as a wise counsel. And so we were sort of flummoxed by that, because the way we looked at it is it was really it's sort of the classic definition, which is it's a woman who's the head of the family, who guides their family, who's a role model. And so when they were sort of quick to reject this moniker, we really were surprised by that, and even thought about changing the name of the study. But we decided to recast, reframe, redefine what it meant to be a modern matriarch. And so that was really what we went after, is to sort of define and decode what those traits were. And we came up with this concept of, again, what's common to both is that of the new matriarch.
So Amy, you just brought to light, the question about term matriarch. I mean, maybe you can help us recast that old moniker to what you deem as this new matriarch. Can you share more about that?
Yeah. There were, as we studied both cohorts, we found that there were a handful of themes that really applied to both. And those themes we attribute to describing what is the new matriarch. And so one of those themes is really centralized around this idea of women as being bridge builders and connectors. And by and large, the women that we study took on this incredibly ambitious and essential task of creating a thread between the business and the family. And they really focused on those connections, and they felt very much that, key to success was really alignment there. Another theme was really addressed how they did that. And one of the ways that they did that was they created a fair and inclusive culture. And they tended to open paths for family members in order to make all family members feel like they could participate, and looked very carefully around ensuring that there was some element of feeling fairly engaged. And I think kind of a third theme around the new matriarch led to how these women, whether they were new to wealth or inheritors, used what we were calling soft power. They used soft power and influence rather than domination. So if you can think about it, they were very careful about empowering people versus dominating power in a more classic sense. And then just lastly, the inner confidence of these women to overcome these obstacles without acrimony was really quite profound. I think Dennis and I thought it was, truly remarkable that there's something inside, and I don't know if it was just the nature of those that we ended up being able to talk to, but they had the strength, sort of the inner strength, to work really hard to overcome those pitfalls or challenges that are many times not there for those, for their male counterparts. So, having that inner confidence to overcome the obstacles without acrimony was sort of the fourth characteristic of what we're calling the new matriarch.
Understood. Well, that's really interesting. And Dennis, I know you're at your core a researcher at Hart, and maybe you can unpack for us what sort of the cohorts also broke down to when it comes to inheritors and vis-a-vis this new matriarch kind of archetype, and what other observations that you started to learn.
Well, first of all, it's an interesting thing about when you begin to get the stories of these women, because they're most of the research on new wealth and entrepreneurs is done by business schools, and because they're business schools, they study the business. And the business story of the entrepreneur is a kind of a myth about an individual, kind of visionary, usually male person who starts it single-handedly and does it himself and has the vision and makes it happen. And that's one story. And that's the story that we get in a lot of entrepreneurial businesses. What we found is by asking the same story from another person, we got a very different, account and a different view. So the women, these women were mostly older in this group. And so they had started the business at a time where even though they were working together with their husbands, it was natural, of course, that the husband would be the leader and that they would just be in the background. So, and even though that was the way it was formally, informally, the role and what these women did as partners was really extensive, far more extensive. So that I think if these people were starting businesses today, we're in a different world, and they would start with the idea, well, of course, we're doing it together, and therefore we're co-leaders. These women were co-leaders, but they didn't feel any need or desire to be billed in that way. So they performed different roles. Some were kind of behind the scenes, bounce ideas off. Some of them actually did very, very essential things, and even made up for some of the deficiencies in their husbands. For example, some of the husbands were very, very focused on their vision, but they weren't very good with personal relationships or explaining it or dealing with details. And so these women took on those things. Now, those are, really made the business successful, but they weren't billed in that way. So these women were all business partners, but they were business partners without usually a formal role. Some of them worked in the business, but there was not a major executive role, and they helped create it. Now there were two kind of roles that came up. Some of these women, just there, were reached a point where their husband died, and they were in a situation where people were saying, "Oh yes, well now you have to find somebody to run the business." And in a number of cases, they said, "Well, I'm going to step out." And a number of these women that weren't really seen as being very business oriented, didn't have a background, stepped up and became the leaders. And so we have a number of widows talking about how they stepped in, and they became the leader and took the business in several cases in different directions. We also had some women who came into wealth as second wives, or after the business was created, and they took on a very, very active role in sewing the family together. Often there was acrimony, and these women would kind of reach out to the former spouse and try to create family harmony. So there was so the second role that these women played was in all these women were very attentive to the fact, not just that we're creating a business and we're creating wealth, but hey, there are children involved. There's a next generation. And these women were, kind of bridging the gap between the business and the next generation, the children. They helped, for example, have the CEO, the husband, pay more attention to them and attend to them. They helped the next generation get involved and learn about the business. And basically, they were mediators between the two cultures. And in some ways, if they weren't around, there might be a real rift, as there are in some families. So the other thing is that they were more sensitive to the fact that there are men and women, and that women can have a role, and they were teaching the next generation that the roles of women, that women could participate, that women could go into the business, and teaching new roles to the next generation. So in a way, they saw gender roles as evolving, and they wanted to not have more traditional views, not have the oldest son go into the business, for example. They wanted to move across into a more collaborative structure in the next generation. The other thing that these women did, which I think really makes a difference, is they were looking not just they looked at succession and the future, but they weren't just looking at how do we keep the business going? How do we make, who's going to run the business? They were looking at what kind of a family culture do we want to have? And they even, we would say that they were the architects of the family culture. They wanted to create for example, teach the next generation not to be so competitive and to work together, to help build a team, to help define the values and say, what is our wealth for? And basically to create a link between the family and the business in the next generation. And so these are all essential tasks, and none of most of them are not business tasks, but they were really creating the next generation and completing the work that sometimes their business founder had created. So it's a pretty incredible story when you look at what they were doing. And often they felt a real conflict between the different parts and really had to pull it together.
It's true that they're not classical business roles, but let's be honest. Historically, women have played that behind the scenes role that kind of makes great leaders. I mean, there's been many great male leaders out there, and you think about the women that are behind them. I think about, from Caesar Augustus, all the way to, I was just in Texas, and, Lady Bird Johnson to our president. I mean, there's just been all these incredible women who don't necessarily need the spotlight, right? The visibility, but they are largely to be credited for the success of their partner. And I love it.
And as a male listening to these stories, I ask myself the question: would these businesses and these men be the success that they were without the role of their spouse and partner in it? And my answer was no. They had limits, they had deficiencies, they had capabilities that only took them so far. And the fact that they were so hugely successful was actually due to the partnership that they were in. And this is not a view that we have of entrepreneurial behavior, because it doesn't fully include the informal role.
One of the hypotheses that we set out to explore was this, just as you said, Kirby, are these women in these families of significant means who have had an enormous impact on our country and indeed in the world, are they the secret sauce? And it was something that actually it ended up being quite true. And as much as they, generally speaking, shunned the limelight of leadership, they were really central to the success of the family business, and of course to the sort of the multi-generational family enterprise. And that was just a wonderful outcome of what we were able to really validate in the study.
Well, I'm super excited that you shined a light on some of these powerful women that played extraordinary leadership roles in their families to help support the success and growth of underlying businesses. But I also loved hearing you both share about the reframing, right? That they're reframing their reality to say gender shouldn't be the issue, right? We need men and we need women around the boardroom table or the C-suite, and encouraging to look beyond gender and to say, let's get the best at the table to help our family grow and learn. I want to just shift gears to the inheritors side of it, because I think I had Joe Riley on not too long ago for the Inheritance Project and his renewed interest in this area. And I really feel with the unprecedented amount of wealth transitioning from one generation to the next, there's a deep curiosity to understand more sort of the female inheritors view. So tell me more. I can't wait to expand on that.
Well, so the women that we looked at were a specific kind of inheritor. They were women who were inheriting wealth, who were coming from a second or third generation of a successful family with great wealth and often a very thriving family business. But the criteria that we used to call them matriarchs is they were not expected to be leaders. They did not grow up saying, I'm going to inherit the business They did not even grow up sometimes saying, I'm going to go into the business. They didn't even sometimes say, I don't even know if I can go into the business. So that they were not intentional, but they had skills and capabilities that led them to take leadership. They somehow felt that they had to do it, or that they had this something that enabled them to do it. So these were women who were inheritors, which have been studied in other places, but women inheritors who step into family leadership and do it in their own way and on their own path. And in so doing, they challenge gender roles, they challenge expectations, they have to deal with the different people in different generations of the family. They have it's also an immense role, but it's not the same as the role of the wealth creators. So we looked at these women who became leaders, even though it was not what was expected of them, and we looked at them in terms of how do they step into this role? How did it happen? First of all, they saw that there was a need, and obviously, as inheritors, the need wasn't to make more money. So that they saw that something was missing in the family. Something had to happen. There was some way in which sometimes women were being treated unfairly. There was some way in which the culture of the family was not sustainable, and they saw a need, and they decided to take it up. Now they talked about, it's very interesting. These were not ordinary women. Most of the women that we talked about having some inner sense of confidence, and sometimes having a deep relationship with their fathers, who were the wealth creators growing up. But for some reason, they when they saw these issues in the family, they didn't throw up their hands and say, well, that's not the way we do it, and I'm not going to get what I want. They really said, no, this is wrong. We have to do something about it. So they stepped up. Some of these families and the inheritors were from what we call old money. They were families that had had money for a number of years. They had large networks of family members, and in many ways, these women said, well, we have great traditions and great legacies, and these families really place a lot of emphasis on the legacy and the values of the family, and you're expected to kind of abide by them. But they saw that the values were, in many cases, unfair to women. They were traditional. They didn't respect innovation. They didn't respect some values that were important to them. So these women, in some cases, had to be pioneers and challenge the traditional assumptions of their family. And just to give one example, one of the women, for example, was wanted to go to a kind of a college, and obviously they had money to do it, and her father said, no, I'm not going to pay for you. Your job is to become a wife and marry someone. You don't need to go to college. And she was furious, and she said, well, I'm going to just pay for it myself. And she did that, and she was estranged from the family for a while until she circled back and got involved. So there are different kinds of ways in which these women have to challenge the norms and really tune in to their inner resources, and this is a real challenge. The other thing that these women did, which I think was special, is they saw that one of the really essential things that the family had to do was to bridge the generations. And the older generation, e.g., their father, sometimes had blind spots, had limitations, had difficulty listening to people, wasn't really supportive. And in a couple of cases, these women became leaders of the family office or the family business because, as I say, she was the only one that could talk to dad. She was the only one that had any influence. And so she was able to be an innovator in the business and get the father to step down, to not be so pushing traditional views and to move in a new direction. And also, she could do that in a way that didn't provoke greater confrontation, didn't make things, weren't destructive, wasn't disrespectful, didn't blow things up in the family. So these women were able to innovate without noise and without a lot of conflict coming up. And they really, they were mediators, not just between their generation and the next generation, but with their brothers and other family members and the older generation. So it was a tremendously demanding role, both and role. And these women performed in incredible ways in taking on this leadership role. And their stories are not just stories of how to, kind of deal with wealth, but how to be an innovator in these challenging families.
Well, I'm so hats off to you both. I'm so appreciative that you undertook this massive research work, but then you also synthesized it into this wonderful book. I love it because it's readable, it's accessible, and you really point out timely, current examples and cases that are relatable. And at the end of the day, I think, finding avenues to empower women in this, extraordinarily fluid time where things are changing rapidly is really what your book to me provokes. And I'm sure, Amy, you guys are capitalizing on different innovative ways to keep this research and this voice alive, literally.
Yeah, I think, a wonderful unintended consequence of this work has been the feedback we've received from the 40 women who participated. Many of them want to get to know each other. And it was music to my ears because I think that there was, not having met each other, obviously, there was a sense of a kindred spirit, and which most certainly emerged given their willingness to be very vulnerable and share sort of honestly their stories, really for the purpose of helping, other women, and certainly the women in the younger generation. We were really pleased to learn as well that in the feedback from these women who said, I want to get to know each other and be a community here. They also were very grateful that somebody helped them tell their story, which was a little confusing to me because I was like, that was just easy, but it was remarkable how many of the women in the study, they didn't view themselves as leaders in their families.
Yeah.
And by having someone help them think through what their story was, there's something freeing about it. And so our ability to help them tell their story is a wonderful consequence. And so I'd love to just sort of close by saying that sort of a second unintended consequence is that while we've finished this book and there were these 40 women, we've had women want to join the conversation. Yeah. And so we continue to build this community. If anyone is listening who thinks that somebody that they know who is a woman of wealth who would like to engage in the conversations, we're going to continue to work and learn together. We're open to it. I don't know about you, Dennis, but I'm done writing a book, but I still want to build a community. And so we really welcome that. Should those who are hearing, what we've done want to join the movement. So thank you, Kirby, for giving us an opportunity to talk about this enormous passion project for both of us.
Well, again,
Yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today, but to have listeners from around the world hear more about this important work. It's something that needs to be on your bookshelf, but maybe your bedside table. There's just some great stories in there. And I guess for every family who has that maybe unsung female in your midst, maybe dig in and start asking questions or put this, on their bedside table and start the conversations in your family. I think it's just fantastic. I know you're doing a lot of speaking all over the place and sharing wisdom from this, but again, I just want to thank you again for being here today on the Tamarind Learning Podcast. Amy Hart, Clyne, Dennis Jaffe, hats off. Incredible book.
Thank
So
you.
happy.
Thank you.
you.